The Morro Castle had 105 fire extinguishers, but on the deck where the fire began, there were none. They had been removed the day before for polishing and had not been returned. Most Morro Castle stories ask who started the fire. I am willing to argue that question has made the disaster easier to misunderstand. Before dawn on September 8, 1934, the Wardline passenger ship was coming north from Havana toward New York. More than 500 people were aboard, most of them asleep. The captain was already dead from heart disease, lost the evening before at 7:45 p.m. His chief officer had taken command only hours earlier. Then a fire appeared in a locker inside the first-class writing room. The official record could name the room. It could name the ship. It could count the boats that left with empty space. What it could not do was prove what lit the first flame. That uncertainty made the Morro Castle famous. But the unsolved spark is not the strongest evidence. The stronger evidence is what happened after the spark. The fire was discovered around 2:10 in the morning, according to the later federal court record. It was not reported to the bridge until shortly before 3. By then, the ship was no longer dealing with a small fire in a locker. It was dealing with a passenger liner whose safety layers were starting to fail one by one. This is the story often told as a mystery: accident, arson, or something worse. That question matters, but it can also hide the larger one. How did a ship with inspections, hydrants, pumps, extinguishers, lifeboats, and rules become so vulnerable that an unknown fire could kill 137 people? The Morro Castle was not an old wooden relic limping through its last voyage. It was a relatively new passenger and freight steamship, built in 1930 at Newport News. The federal court later described it as 508 feet long, with a 70-foot beam, a twin-screw turboelectric vessel working the route between New York and Havana. It was built for a world that wanted speed, comfort, and confidence. The Wardline sold the voyage as part travel, part leisure. New York to Havana, Havana back to New York, a floating hotel moving through a regular commercial circuit. That matters because the disaster did not begin in a place that looked lawless. It began inside a system that looked regulated. The ship had modern firefighting equipment. The court record lists 42 hydrants, 3 pumps, and 105 fire extinguishers. It had lifeboats. It had been inspected in 1934. The last inspection was about a month before the fire. So the first layer of the episode is not absence. It is contradiction. The equipment existed. The drill record existed. The inspection record existed. But when the fire arrived, existence was not the same as readiness. Captain Robert R. Wilmot died on the evening of September 7th. The court record places his death at 7:45 p.m. while the ship was returning from Havana. Chief Officer William F. Worms took command. That command change did not cause the fire. The record does not support that, but it changed the condition of the ship in the hours before the emergency. A vessel that had expected one captain now had another man carrying the authority of the bridge. Then came the fire. The later record says it was found by a passenger in a locker on the port side of the writing room, forward on B deck. Other summaries place the time closer to 2:45 or 3 hours. The exact minute varies by source, and the script should not pretend that every clock agrees. What matters is the interval. A fire was seen low and forward. The bridge did not receive a prompt alarm. Crew members apparently tried to fight it before calling for broader help. By the time the alarm became a command problem, the fire had momentum. Here the mystery changes shape. The question is no longer only what lit the locker. It is why the first report did not move fast enough through the ship. Fire at sea is not simply fire. It is fire inside a machine that is also a building, a hotel, a workplace, and a lifeboat platform. Every minute changes the geometry. A passage closes, a stair becomes smoke, a deck route disappears. A passenger who could have walked forward must now move aft. A crew member who should be at a station is now improvising in a corridor. For a passenger asleep in a cabin below the upper decks, the first sign of the fire could have been smoke under a door, running feet in the corridor, or, if both came late, heat already in the walls. Most of the people aboard learned about the emergency from the air around them, not from any alarm sent through the ship's system. The Morro Castle did not need every safety feature to fail. It needed enough of them to fail in the right order. First, detection and reporting were slow, then firefighting response struggled. Then the fire spread through passenger spaces, where wood and finish gave it fuel. Then access to lifeboats narrowed. Then radio distress went out late. Then lifeboats that could carry hundreds left with far fewer people than their capacity. A disaster at sea becomes inevitable when the ship stops being a system and becomes a collection of disconnected reactions. The federal court record is blunt about the delay. It says no radio distress signal went out until 3:15 and that this was only a standby signal. The SOS came 13 minutes later. The same record says the Andrea Luckenbach was within 3 miles. 3 miles is close enough for rescue to matter. 13 minutes is long enough for fire to redraw a ship. That is the difference between nearby help and delayed summons. The equipment record tells the same story. The Morro Castle had hydrants, pumps, and extinguishers. On paper, that sounds reassuring. But at the time the fire was discovered, the court record says there were no extinguishers on B deck. They had been removed the day before for polishing and had not been returned to their proper places. This is not a Gothic clue. It is ordinary negligence with a deadly deadline. An extinguisher removed for appearance is a small fact until the fire starts beside the place where it should have been. The hydrants tell the same story with more machinery. The court record says at least some hydrants did not have hose attached, and several were capped. One capped B-deck hydrant was the nearest hydrant to the writing room where the fire was first discovered. It had been capped because its valve was leaking. That detail is the Morro Castle in miniature. A leak was made manageable by making a safety outlet less ready. Nothing about that proves arson. Nothing about that solves the spark. But it shows the ship's real weakness. Small workarounds had been allowed to sit inside an emergency system. I am willing to argue that the cleanest record in this case is not the arson speculation. It is the inspection record beside the physical failures the inspection did not prevent. The pumps add another layer. The fire main served 42 hydrants. The pumps could discharge 600 gallons a minute, 3 times the amount the steamboat inspectors required for a ship of the Morro Castle's size. But the court record says only 6 hydrants could be supplied with full pressure at once. If more were used, pressure dropped proportionately. That is not proof that the ship was below the legal standard. In fact, the court says the equipment exceeded the requirement. But it is proof that legal sufficiency is not the same thing as emergency clarity. In a spreading fire, a crew has to know not only that water exists, but how the system behaves under stress. The record says Worms and Chief Engineer Eben Abbott admitted they had not been informed of that limitation by the company's managing officers and were not aware of it. This is the midpoint turn. The Morro Castle was not unsafe because it had no safety equipment. It was unsafe because the relationship between equipment, crew knowledge, and actual emergency conditions was weaker than the paperwork made it appear. The drills tell another version of the same story. The law required station bills, fire drills, boat drills, and log entries. A passenger ship needed to assign emergency duties, so crew members knew where to go and what to do. The Morro Castle had records of drills, but the court found the practice inadequate. It described a fire drill routine in which only the forward and after mooring gangs gathered and put 2 hoses into operation. It said 24 men in the engineers department alone had no stations assigned to them on the fire quarters bill, and that many others either had no stations or did not know them. Some crew members were unfamiliar with lowering lifeboats. Others did not know how to row. Those are not dramatic details, they are operational facts. They explain why a ship with lifeboats could still become a place where people had to jump into the sea. The Morro Castle had 12 lifeboats. Contemporary and later sources differ in small numerical details, but the pattern is consistent. Only 6 were launched and they left with far fewer people than they could have carried. The federal court record states that 6 lifeboats with capacity for 408 passengers were launched. It says 10 passengers and 87 crew escaped in Morro Castle lifeboats. A Coast Guard engineering training note gives an even starker shorthand. Only 6 of 12 lifeboats were launched, with only 85 people in them. The exact accounting varies because different records count different categories. The meaning does not vary. Space existed in boats that did not become rescue. This is where the obvious story, the burning ship, gives way to the institutional one. Without training, command, access, and timing, the boat is only an object hanging from davits. By the time many passengers were trying to escape, fire had cut off access to the boats. The court says passengers were ordered aft to lower decks, away from the fire. But as the fire spread, many were cut off from boat access and forced to jump. Some survived through other vessels and local rescue craft, not through the ship's own evacuation system. The ship's own safety plan had lost control of its own passengers. The image most people remember came later. The burned hulk of the Morro Castle grounded near Asbury Park. Photographs show the ship close to shore, a blackened monument that people could stand on the beach and stare at. SUNY Maritime's Roy Morris photograph collection describes images taken from a pier after the vessel stranded on a sandbar near the Jersey shore. The Asbury Park Historical Society records that the still-burning ship became a major local spectacle before it was removed months later. That visual afterlife is important. It helped make the disaster memorable as an image. But images can flatten a failure chain. The beached wreck says fire, the record says delay, drills, capped hydrants, misplaced extinguishers, late radio, uncertain cause, and lifeboats that did not carry the people they could have carried. That is why the episode should not be framed as a solved crime. Arson has always hovered over the Morro Castle. Later documentaries and accounts have focused on radio operator George Rogers, on Captain Wilmot's death, on suspicions that the fire had been deliberately set. Those suspicions are part of the public memory. They are not the same as proof. Maritime Cyprus states the origin of the fire was never conclusively determined. The federal court record says the cause had never been discovered. The Coast Guard engineering note says the cause was never determined. 3 different types of source point to the same limit. The spark is not safe to solve. The conditions are. That is the ethical center of the story. If we turn the unknown cause into a secret culprit, we make the episode more clickable and less honest. If we stop at cause unknown, we miss the facts that investigators and courts did record. I read the 1940 court record as a map of practical failure, not as a locked room mystery. It shows a ship that passed inspection but had extinguishers missing from the deck where the fire was found. It shows a ship with hydrants, but a nearest hydrant capped because of a leak. It shows a ship with pumps above the required capacity, but command officers who did not know the pressure limitation. It shows a ship with drills in the log, but crew members who did not know stations, davits, or rowing. It shows a ship with radio, but a distress call delayed until the fire had already changed the odds. That is not a clean conspiracy. It is more disturbing because it is administrative. It is the kind of failure that can hide inside compliance. After the disaster, the regulatory world changed. Maritime Cyprus and the Asbury Park Historical Society connect the Morro Castle to fire-retardant materials, automatic fire doors, ship-wide fire alarms, fire drills, and lifeboat procedures. A Coast Guard Museum article places Morro Castle beside the Mohawk collision in the wave of 1936 and 1937 legislation, including rules over passenger ship structure, equipment, materials, crewing, and federal supervision. The lesson is that safety had been defined too narrowly. The most specific evidence sits in the drill record itself. A ship could log fire drills and still have crew members who did not know their station, did not know how to lower a lifeboat, and in some cases did not know how to row. That is the real cover that the Morro Castle exposes. Not a proven cover-up, a cover made of paper, polish, inspection, routine, and the assumption that equipment equals protection. The people aboard paid for the difference. Public memorial sources commonly give the death toll as 137 passengers and crew. Some official and legal records use different numbers, including 134, 124, or a category count of dead and missing that totals 115 in the 1940 case. The safest way to speak this is to use the widely memorialized 137 while noting in the production packet that casualty accounting differs across records. What should not differ is the responsibility chain. The fire began in a place investigators could identify, but not explain. The report to the bridge came late. Firefighting equipment existed, but readiness was compromised. Crew training existed on paper, but failed under pressure. The distress call came late. The boats launched with too few people. The wreck came ashore in daylight. where the public could see the end of the chain, but not all the links that produced it. The Morro Castle did not become inevitable when the first flame appeared in a locker. It became inevitable when a modern ship was allowed to treat safety as inventory. Hydrants counted, extinguishers counted, boats counted, drills counted. But in the dark, with fire moving through passenger spaces, the count was not enough. The question was whether those parts could become action fast enough to save people. On the Morro Castle, too many of them could not. That is why the unresolved cause should remain unresolved. The record is more useful when it is allowed to keep its limits. The spark may have been accidental, it may have been deliberate, it may never be known. But the disaster did not require a proven arsonist to become a catastrophe. It required a ship whose safety system looked complete until the night it had to work.